In this video, we're going to do some sky replacement inside of Blender. So this is actually a continuation of my little Stupid Easy VFX mini-series here on YouTube. In the last video, we took a handheld shot and stabilized it so that we could have a locked off plate that we can then easily swap out skies, add decals, do anything we want like that, and then apply the camera data back onto it. So we're going to just keep going forward with that video. If you're interested in the stabilization part, go back and watch that video and come back and join us for this. If you're just interested in the sky replacement, no worries, you'll be able to follow along just fine. So we're going to take a shot like this and turn it into this by creating a mask using the luminance key node inside of Blender's compositor, and then composite it all together using some fun stuff. So let's jump right into it. As I mentioned, this is where we left off in the last video. We used 2 points of motion tracking to stabilize our footage, and then we're just using the stabilize 2D node to make sure this is a locked off camera. So now that whatever sky replacement we do, we're able to put the camera data back onto this footage by inverting that, and then it'll look like the same movement is applied to our sky replacement. So what I'm going to do is let's give ourselves some room here, and let's actually just illustrate how we're going to do the sky replacement using the stabilize 2D node. So I'm going to press Shift A and drop in an image node, and I'm just going to grab my sky image, and this is just a nice little mountainous background that I got from textures.com. And what I'm going to do is just mix this with our footage using an alpha over so that we can see what's going on here. Control Shift click to view that, and you can see we're just viewing 100% the background image because the factor is set to 1. So if we turned it down, we'd view our footage, and then if we go halfsies, then it's just mixing between the two. So obviously we want this background image to be restricted to just the sky and the sky plate to be removed. If you are doing the stabilized part where you're coming from the previous video, then what you'll want to do at this point, just to kind of make sure we're on the right track as far as getting this background image tracked in with our footage. Because right now, if you scrub through, you can see that our shot's locked off. If we grab this stabilize 2D node, Shift D and duplicate it, and then drop it after the alpha over. So once we add that in there, if we just hit invert on that, it reverses the stabilization, and everything past this point has the camera data reapplied essentially. So now that background image stays perfectly tracked with our footage. I mean, you might notice a little bit off, a little bit of distortion, but that's okay. It's not going to be noticeable enough. Depending on how clean your track was, that image should stay pretty well locked to our footage, which is great. That's exactly what we want. This makes it really easy if we wanted to add cracks to the windows or add a damage decal or something. We could easily do that right inside the compositor and it would stay tracked. Now, you are noticing an issue though, is that this image doesn't fill up the entire footage. Well, that's not a problem. What we can do is just add a transform node onto this image right after that, and we'll just scale this up a bit, and then we can make adjustments. We'll tweak this all later, but we can kind of slide things around, move it up in our scene so that we get the mountain range where we want it. But it's sort of hard to see, where we should put our background plate because we need to mask out the sky. So this is kind of the bread and butter of the sky replacement, is how do you get rid of a sky? Well, my favorite way is skies are usually the brightest thing in a scene, especially if they're, if it's slightly overcast or if the sky's blown out a little bit, overexposed. It makes it really easy to pull a key on the light. And we can do that using a luminance key node. So I'm going to press Shift A and drop in a luminance key node right after this stabilized 2D right there. And what this allows us to do is if we view the matte of this, you can see it's trying to find the light and dark values in your footage. And so you can easily sort of clamp in on those values by adjusting this high and low. And Blender does a really good job at finding the parts in your footage that have the most luminance, and it just keys them out, creating a nice black and white matte. You want the cleanest matte you can get, and you want to make sure you don't start to get any part of your house disappearing. For now, I'm pretty happy with that matte. That's a pretty clean black and white matte. And now what we can do is use this as the factor of our alpha over node to decide what parts of that display the sky and what parts display our footage. And voila, you've replaced the sky. But now, if you are working, like I said, with the stabilized 2D node, if we view this, we're going to see that sky is tracked in perfectly. We have the matte all in place, and everything is looking as it should. So now you might want to blur this luminance matte a little bit. There's some sharp jaggedy edges. And then of course you can adjust the high and low value a little bit. I am going to just drop in a quick blur node here and just blur it slightly. I don't want to go too crazy. Now you'll notice as soon as I do that, so if I press M to disable that blur node, our sky texture is the correct scale. If I enable the blur node, it shrinks down this image. For some reason, it gets confused with this blur node. I'm not really sure why it's doing that. It's a little bit confusing, but if we duplicate this stabilized 2D node and drop it in after that blur node, then you can see we're right back at where it was, but now our actual luminance key is off. And that's because we're basically kind of stabilizing twice here. So what we need to do is actually just grab the image output and plug that directly into the luminance key, and that should snap everything back in place. So basically, any of the mattes you create, if you're going to make adjustments to them, you need to add the stabilization after the fact instead of before, so that the matte gets the same transformation data as the movie clip. So now if we view our final node, everything should be tracked in perfectly, and we still get our little blur in there. So now you have replaced the sky. Now you might be saying, well, there's some roughness. I'm still seeing some bleed over through the sky. There's a few things we could do. We could create a mask to kind of bring back some of this tree if we wanted to do that. Or in this case, what I like to do is just add some atmosphere fog to the background to really hide all this kind of milkiness of the previous sky that's in there. And that actually helps tie the whole thing together nicely with a nice sky replacement. It adds depth, and it's going to add a lot of natural atmosphere to make it look that much more realistic. So if you have a fog or atmosphere plate or image that you want to use, you can certainly grab that. But you can also just make one really easily right inside of Blender. So let's do that. I'm going to go over here to textures and create a new texture and just choose clouds. Leave all the normal settings, that's fine. Let's feeling fancy, so let's name this fog. And then we'll come down here, and we know we want the fog to be after our background sky plate and before our footage. So somewhere right in here, let's give ourselves some room to add in this sort of fog texture. And the way I'm going to do that is just use a mix node and drop that in right here. So now you see on our background plate, we're mixing the color white with the background plate, and we basically can just input whatever we want right there. So if you want to add an additional layer, maybe another layer of mountains, maybe another set of clouds, or whatever you want to add, this is just a really easy way to construct your sky replacement so that you can add different layers and depth. This is just a small illustration of what you can do. So I'm going to drop in a, not an image node, I'm actually going to drop in a texture node because we created a texture over here. And I'm going to grab our fog texture right there and plug it in just to the image of that mix node. And now you can see we have that texture mixed in. We don't want it to just be a mix factor. We actually want to just set that to screen so that we get some nice light shining through there. And that looks nice. And you can play with the blend modes. Soft light would be a good one too. I'm going to stick with screen though. Now you can see we have the same problem where our texture isn't fitting the bounds of our footage. So let's actually just grab another transform node. We can duplicate this one right here. So I'm going to grab this, press Shift and D, and just drop that in over that texture. And now it fits within the parameters of our footage. And you can see we have a nice amount of haze in our background, and it pretty much completely hides the imperfections there in our key from the trees. But fog really stays lower to the ground or the mountains. We don't want it to go up into the sky unless you want to do like a clouds thing going on here. But I want it to really kind of cut off right here. So I need a mask to determine where I want that fog to stop. So you could go into masking and create a custom mask, or you can just create a box mask right inside the compositor. So let's just do that because that's easy. I'm going to grab a box mask and give ourselves some room here. And if we Control Shift click and view that, you can see it's just a rectangle right there in the center. Let me show you what's going on here. We can use these X and Y values to move that mask around, and then we can increase the height of it, and then of course the width, make it pretty wide, just so it kind of covers the lower half of the screen. Again, this is just really simple, basic stuff here, but it's effective. And I actually want to view after the stabilize node. There we go. So now we see our fog is contained to this mask. And add a little bit of rotation maybe, so it's not just a flat line that looks obvious. And that's looking good. Obviously, you don't want a sharp line like that at all. So let's go ahead and blur the bounds of this mask. So we can do that with just adding a really easy blur node here. You guys know if you watch my videos, I like to blur things all the time. And now we have a nice blurred edge there to that mask. But we're having the same problem we had up here with the stabilize node, where we actually need to duplicate this stabilize 2D because we blurred our mask. Again, I'm not sure why that's a thing. If someone can please help me out. It doesn't make sense to me, mathematically speaking, why it assumes we're jumping back to the pre-stabilized version. But let's go ahead and duplicate it because it's what works. Don't question the mind of Blender. All right, so now we have our fog in there and our shot is really coming together nicely. Things are really starting to tie together. I think I want to adjust the location of my background plate so that I see a few more mountains in there. So I'll just bring that up along the Y a little bit. And there you go. That's looking a lot nicer, just like that. I think my fog is a bit too dense. So a way we can easily adjust the density of our fog is to, before the stabilize node, let's come over here, and after our box mask, let's add in a mix node and drop that in. And instead of mix, we'll set this to multiply it by color black. Black equals a value of 0. So now that gives us a factor slider that we can adjust to kind of dial in how much fog we want in the background there. Really cool. A lot of cool compositing tricks you can do here for your sky replacement. Totally transform a shot, get something really, really different and interesting. All these things are meant to really put you in the driver's seat of your own shot, of your own creation, and tweak things how you like it. So I'm going to dial this back a little bit. Get that nice atmosphere in there without losing my background plate too much. And the final thing would be to try to color correct your two images so that value and saturation wise they match. They're already pretty close. I chose an image that matched my footage plate pretty well, but there is a little bit of work you could do, such as I want to actually decontrast this background image and brighten this foreground image a bit. So I'm going to drop in a brightness contrast node right after my image plate and take down the contrast just slightly. And then I'm going to duplicate that node and on my footage, put the contrast back up and brighten it a bit. Just so value wise, we kind of get something that's living in the same area. And it's okay if it all looks flat because what we're going to do is be able to color grade that together. And I'm going to actually take out some saturation because the saturation of the background is just slightly more than the foreground. And I want them to live really in the same color space, at least as close as I can. So that's looking a lot better. Again, this is really optional and going to depend on what footage and plate you've chosen to work with. But now we have a fairly flat profile and everything that kind of lives in the same space that we can then go ahead and just do our color correction or color grading. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this kind of thing is so subjective and everyone has a different idea on how they want to do color correction. But certainly you can just dial in your footage so that it's exactly the look and feel that you want. The important thing is that before you get to this point, you really match the values of both your foreground plate and your background plate, so that once you get into color correction, you can tie it all together in a way that'll make it look really nice. All right, so to wrap this up, we have a fully tracked in sky replacement with our handheld footage here. We were able to key out the sky using a luminance key node to separate our sky from our foreground plate. We were then able to mix that with an alpha over node and our background image plate. We added a little bit of fog and atmosphere in there, and then used a simple box mask to determine where that fog should go. And of course, we did a little bit of color correction and then some color grading to kind of tie it all together. If you want to just render that out, hook up your composite node, set your render settings over here, and then simply come up here to render and render out your animation. All right, so that's the end of this video. That wraps up sky replacement inside of Blender using some 2 points of motion tracking. I hope this was a useful little tip for you guys. Drop in the comments if you were able to apply this to a result that you did. I'd love to see it and check it out. Until next time, thanks for watching as always.